Sexual violence has been a huge part of the process that took the land that is Canada. The history of residential schools is a history of a deliberate state attempt to extinguish culture, and because that culture carried with it powerful ties to land that the Canadian government wanted. And what we see around the world is that there is no more effective way to weaken communities than through sexual violence, through the way it reverberates through generations. And so, we hear about the abuse in residential schools and how sexual abuse was rampant, and this is treated as kind of something that people maybe didn't know about, but of course they did know about it. But the fact is, this was all part of a process of breaking identities and breaking with it that connection to the land. And so I think that violence against Indigenous people, violence against Indigenous women in particular, and the failure of the Canadian government to do anything about it for so long, has to be seen within that context, within the context of sexual violence actually serving the Canadian state, sexual violence against Indigenous people and particularly Indigenous women, but not only women, also sexual violence against men. So I don't see the inaction of the Canadian state as just lack of concern. I actually think it's self-interest. I think Indigenous people are a real threat to the Canadian government, or this particular Canadian government's vision of constantly extracting natural resources, particularly fossil fuels. I mean, who are the biggest threats to that vision? It's Indigenous people exercising their inherent and constitutionally protected rights to the land. I see this as a really important moment where the arts community in Toronto and more broadly in Canada is stepping up and saying this is not just an Indigenous issue. The timing of it is really interesting too, because in the States right now, there's this really powerful movement of people taking to the streets under the banner that Black Lives Matter, and this is happening in the face of state violence against African Americans. But what's remarkable about this moment in the States is that it isn't just being treated as an African American problem. It's whole communities that are coming out, people of all ethnicities, saying that they also believe that Black Lives Matter and are saying these acts are unacceptable. There's never been a movement in Canada of non-Indigenous people saying Indigenous lives matter. And a society gets a message when a group of people are treated as disposable. When throughout the culture people are treated as disposable, then the police act based on that. The courts act based on those values. I see this as a moment, a shift, where there's a greater, taking of responsibility. And I think part of it is that we know that this government is not going to fulfill its responsibility. I think there's no part of the Harper government that wants to strengthen Indigenous communities. And the trauma of violence weakens communities. I don't see why anyone would expect them to sincerely help this process of healing. I'm telling the story of one woman among 1,200, Bella Labukan McLean, and her story is shocking. I mean, she was a 25-year-old, incredibly talented young woman who had just graduated from Humber, had her whole life ahead of her, and she fell from a downtown condo building under very suspicious circumstances. Circumstances the police described as suspicious at the time. The case is still open, it's being investigated. But it's shocking to me that it was not reported in the Toronto media. And at the time, because I'm close friends with the family, with Bella's family, I called reporters that I knew, at the Toronto Star, at the CBC, at Now, and we did get some coverage. But it was 2 weeks before a single story was written about Bella. Can you imagine a white 25-year-old, beautiful, just out of university, falling 31 stories from a downtown condo with 5 people in that apartment, none of whom claim they know anything or saw anything, would be the front page of the paper. And that's just a glimpse into this racism, and it is racism. And it has to be seen as part of this colonial history where we systematically refuse to see Indigenous people. That's the narrative of our country, of pretending we came to uninhabited lands, or so sparsely populated we didn't have to take it seriously, and then claiming that, okay, well, they were there, but they all died, and they're barely there, and it's really just a history. It isn't people who are alive now and have current claims to the land. So this unseeing of Indigenous women is not something new. Our whole country is founded on not seeing Indigenous people. A lot of the shift has happened from the ground up through resistance to the Harper government's very aggressive agenda of pushing pipelines through territories that don't want them, pushing fracking in provinces that don't want it, and through these responses, like the British Columbia just coming together to oppose tankers on their coast, or New Brunswick saying we don't want fracking. In all of these movements, Indigenous people are at the forefront, and their land rights are the most powerful tool, the most powerful barrier to what these governments are trying to push through against the will of people. So what has shifted, in my view, is that non-Indigenous Canadians now understand that Indigenous land rights are not something that are taking away something from us, but are actually a gift, are actually our best hope of not trashing this country and trashing the planet. So the relationships that get built in these very real struggles, are lasting. And then, if somebody something happens in their family, then you support them because they're your friend.